So I'll say a little bit about Conciliation Resources and Accord, and a little bit about this particular project, and as I say, then I'll hand over to Kate to moderate the panel. So, yes, Accord is published by Conciliation Resources. Now, Conciliation Resources is primarily a peace-building practice organisation, an independent organisation based in the UK, but the main focus is on actually building peace, and in particular, supporting local peace builders in a number of contexts affected by conflict around the world, in East and Central Africa, West Africa, the Horn of Africa, in South Asia, Southeast Asia, Caucasus, Pacific and Latin America. And that's important for me to mention that, coming from Conciliation Resources, but I think it has particular significance because it means that our research and our advocacy is very much grounded in practice. What we try to do as an organisation is capture the lessons of what people are really trying to do, is to build peace in their environments, and capture that and share that with practice and policy communities worldwide. And one of the ways we do that is through the Accord publication. A more eagle-eyed of you may notice that this is issue number 27. So it's been around a while, Accord. CR's been around for maybe 21 years, and Accord has been around for the same amount of time. And it really reflects the ethos, the rationale, and some of the methodology of CR, interest in inclusion, and interest in peace processes and peace building, and interest in practice. And we hope that the methodology means that the research and the findings of the research have a real applied and practical value. So a little bit about this particular project then. So looking at peace in Afghanistan, and I think the regular news reports of attacks that we get regularly in Afghanistan remind us of the real need for peace there. But also, at the same time, some things like President Ghani's offer in February of this year, as well as things like the Helmand Peace March initiative, show us that there are some positive signs, and that maybe there is some space for progress. And there's so for people like me, that gives us some optimism and some room for hope. And we really hope that this Accord publication project can contribute in some way to moving things forward. As I mentioned, Accord really reflects some of CR's inclusive methodology to peace. And we have that in the sort of editorial methodology for Accord. We have a lot of contributions from a range of different types of perspective, from people who have, many of whom have real experience of conflict and of peace in Afghanistan. So we have Afghan and international men and women, parties to the conflict on both the government side and from the armed opposition contributing to the Accord publication, international diplomats, human rights and women's rights activists, peace practitioners, as well as expert analysts. And we hope that this really contributes to the practical value of the publication, to really help to understand, on the one hand, what are the different priorities for peace in Afghanistan, but also what is the space for these to be negotiated successfully in any peace process. And I think both those things, and the balance between both those things, is really important. We really hope that Accord then comes in somewhere at the convergence between theory and practice for peace building. And I think that's happened in a very real way with this particular project and publication. I mentioned that this bit of research is part of a bigger project on the political settlements research program, which is really trying to understand how peace processes can revise political settlements to be more inclusive so as to end conflict. And one of the key dilemmas that project has been looking at is the relationship between peace deals struck between armed parties to conflict and then broader processes to address the root causes of conflict, which require much broader participation beyond those parties. And that relationship is often seen as problematic, or there's a tension between those two different ambitions. Peace processes, research has been suggesting, are successful and have been successful at ending violence through a peace agreement, but they've really been quite bad at transforming this into longer-term commitments for broader social and political reform. So we tend to get a situation of either partial or temporary peace and political stalemate. And perhaps the sort of post-bomb situation in Afghanistan reflects that. But it also, I think, is informative about how to go forward in Afghanistan, where part of the real key to sustainable peace requires a significant renegotiation of the social contract. But progress towards this is really blocked at a very sort of fundamental level, particularly by a lack of confidence amongst the parties about how to take this forward. So one of the things that's really come out of our research is that reducing violence is a real prerequisite to having more fundamental conversations about transformative change. So from that perspective, the challenges going forward are, therefore, in the first instance, what are the viable ways to reduce violence in this context with a fractured insurgency and high levels of violence fighting across the country? What are the options there? At the same time, how to ensure that initiatives to end violence do not close down space for more transformative change, to get into that real trap that I described a little bit earlier on. So those are difficult challenges, and we think we've got some good suggestions about how to go past those, which we can discuss a lot later on. But I think that's enough for me to introduce, and now I'll hand over to Kate.
This is a really welcome publication, I should say right at the onset. This year, Afghanistan entered its 40th year of war, and I woke up on the 1st of January thinking it is time to stop. 40 years of a conflict is far too much. I didn't wake up with any big ideas, I just thought it's time for change. And that was brought home to me in April when I was in Kabul. I was interviewing people who'd lost family members after the Sour coup. They'd been disappeared by the PDPA regime and still looking for bodies. These people 40 years on are still looking for the bodies of their fathers or their brothers, uncles. And in the same week, I went to 2 funeral ceremonies, 2 fatahas for people who'd been killed in Kabul that week. I lost another friend, one of the 9 journalists who were killed. And you know, the atrocious suffering should not be underestimated. 10,000 civilians alone, that's excluding the combatants, civilians alone last year were killed or injured in the war in Afghanistan, and more people became IDPs. I think we're up to about over 1 million now. Livelihoods lost, families ripped apart. So I feel like this is a good timely publication. Number one, something needs to happen. Number two, peace does seem to be in the air in very sort of minimal, embryonic ways at the moment. I was struck by how many people on the international side, the military and the civilian, were talking about what can we do to support the peace process. Notice they've talked about a peace process, even though one isn't really happening yet. President Ghani's offered to the Taliban. We've had the nascent peace march from Helmand. We've got this great model next door in Fatah, in the tribal areas of Pakistan, where people are looking, Pashtuns are looking for their civil rights and an end to the war. There seems to be something happening at the moment, and one of the things I liked about your publication was that it brought fresh ideas and fresh voices to the topic. I mean, it's something that probably all of us have thought about a lot, but there's some really good, fresh practical ideas and some new voices. And just to mention a couple, one was I enjoyed the fact that you've got civilians and you've got Taliban. You've got some interesting mid-level senior Taliban, and they, you know, strangely, I'm not going to stray into your topic too much, Anna, but they sound like Afghans. They're talking about jobs. They're talking about the influence of Pakistan. They're talking about representation. They're talking about their rubbish leadership. They're talking about ethnic problems at the provincial level. The governor not working properly. I mean, if I didn't know that they were Taliban, I mean, they refer to Sharia and other things as well, but they sound like proper Afghan, normal human beings. And one of the things I like, you talk about the drivers towards war, which are deep and fundamental, the war economy, the corruption, the fact that there are fundamental problems with the country, but I came away with a strong feeling of that there is a consensus there, overlapping concerns, if not overlapping narratives, and that there are things that can be done. So, without saying any more, I will hand over to the speakers.
Okay, I'd like to just start out by, well, firstly thanking you all for coming to the launch today. It's wonderful to see so many faces. But also by echoing Kate's opening statements, by reflecting on something that I've come across time and again in Afghanistan, and that is that it's not possible to talk to anybody who is not being affected by loss of life or livelihood. It's just not possible to find anybody to talk to who hasn't been affected by those things as a result of the war. And then perhaps for this reason, then, the very deep and the very widespread impact of conflict in the country. When talking to Afghans, there's this real sense that either people cannot or don't dare to imagine what a peaceful Afghanistan might actually look like, let alone what the practical means of getting there might be. And this sort of lack of tangible vision, I suppose, is echoed in intellectual circles in Kabul as well, where the entrenched war economy is breathtakingly evident. It's also reflected in Taliban perspectives. In a recent conversation with a member of a Taliban caucus, he told me that after 15 years, a war stops being a war and becomes something else entirely, basically implying that you lose sight of the initial rationale, the reason for conducting the war in the first place. The ends get lost amid the means, and a rampant conflict economy can cloud the original ideological action, or the reason for the ideological action in the first place. And then finally, this lack of vision is reflected in international policy-making circles, where fatigue with the Afghan situation, the Afghan conflict, is debilitating innovative strategy. There's no sense of how to move forward because of this fatigue with the situation. And the path of least resistance then becomes to continue funding state-building initiatives in coin, which, again, don't have this sort of strategic vision, where they're going, what these activities are contributing towards, either militarily or politically. So it's been the aim of this accord then not to prescribe what that peace vision for Afghanistan should actually be, but to get back to basics, to start stripping away some of the many assumptions that cloud our judgment on this, and to distill valuable practical lessons from academia, from policy, from practice, and also, most importantly, from personal experience, which is one of the reasons why we've included local civilian perspectives. And this is about paths going forward, practical paths going forward. So as Zara mentioned, the Accord starts with the statement that any progress towards peace will require an immediate reduction in violence, because building trust between the main warring parties will inevitably involve credible commitments, at least in the short term, towards this. And then from this basis, then, we talk about how a set of incremental agreements might be developed that can then build towards a sustainable end to bloodshed. And this sustainable end will involve institutional change towards a new inclusive social contract. And while this presents a formidable task, we identify based on the perspectives that are gathered in this publication, 4 key areas to prioritize in this regard. The first is political reform, which I suspect Scott will talk to in a little while. political reform involving the creation of space for legitimate, peaceful opposition in the political system. The second of these priorities is a national peace dialogue where the root causes of conflict can be addressed, where opportunities for transitional justice can be developed as well. The third is looking to the creation of a Peace and Security Commission that would help to revitalise SSR, security sector reform, and as such reinforce the peace process, providing opportunities, for example, for the integration of former combatants. And the fourth is economic reform, dealing with issues such as land grabbing, customs, problems of parliamentary privileges that really need to be assessed if any trust from the public is going to be restored in government ability to govern effectively. I'd like to just quickly highlight a few editorial decisions that we made in the publication, perhaps anticipating some of the comments that might come afterwards. The first of these is that we focus on two main actors, the Afghan government and Taliban. Of course, there are many actors in Afghanistan's conflict. They're not limited to these groups, and of course there are many actors, many different narratives and many different stances within these two groups. IS, ISK, ISIS, not released. But beginning somewhere, again, stripping down to basics is important. And these two groups have both expressed an interest in seeing the end to the needless killing of Afghans. That message is very clear from all the different Taliban caucuses that are represented in this publication. And so starting there provides a basis for moving forward and including other groups later on. The second decision I want to just highlight is that there is a substantial focus on history in the publication. We allocate a third of the contributions to looking back to Afghanistan's history, not just broadly as an overview, but also to very specific periods that have been overlooked. And I'd like to highlight in particular Hila Najibullah's contribution. She hopefully will be joining us in a few minutes. But her very detailed look at President Najibullah's attempt to form a peace process with Mujahideen factions in the 1980s is really interesting, and it's often overlooked. It doesn't get the attention, I think, that it deserves, and so having a deep dive into that particular period of history is important to see how peace processes have been attempted and how they have failed in the past. So that's one of the reasons why we wanted to place a significant emphasis on history. And then thirdly, the Accord is very much Afghanistan focused. Sounds obvious, but we are very much aware, of course, that regional and international dynamics play a huge part in how the conflict in Afghanistan progresses. But on the other hand, this accord comes from the perspective that insulating Afghanistan against the influences of the region is critical to starting the peace process in a sustainable way. Yes, we're aware of regional funding of combatants, but if Afghanistan ceases to supply those combatants, then there'll be fewer opportunities for regional spoilers. And for this reason, we have focused very particularly on Afghanistan. And whilst there is acknowledgement in some of the contributions, those by Barney Rubin, that one by Barney Rubin in particular, of the regional dynamics, not ignoring them, but making sure that Afghanistan is at the centre. As Kate mentioned, there have been various indicators in 2018 that there is a potential now for Afghanistan to take a radical new direction away from continual embedded violence and towards an incremental peace. And we think that the contributions to this accord present a compelling case to this effect. I hope you find that as well.
Thank you very much for having me, for including me in the event and the publication. I want to structure this to talk a little bit about the present, go back to the past, and then talk about the future. So where are we, how did we get here, and where do we go? Like the other panelists, frequent contact with Afghanistan. I had the fortune of being there just a few weeks ago to look into the situation, and what I found was part of a deteriorating trend, unfortunately. And so I think I would underscore the previous comments about the timeliness of this and the real need for it, because I think without a change of direction, we can anticipate what will happen, which is further decline of the situation. I think there are a few new factors that should be borne in mind as you consider options for what to do. One, what we hear from all sources in Afghanistan is the increasing ethnic polarization of the country and of politics. That's being exacerbated by the current electoral processes that are underway, but it's been building for a while. And the introduction of Islamic State with a more overt, explicit sectarian motive for their violence further drives parties apart. And that has been expressed by many Afghan political leaders as something that is even worse than the current conflict if it attains a true ethnic dimension. Secondly, I think there is increasing fragmentation of deteriorating security, but fragmentation of the security picture such that you have more different factions within the Taliban to an extent, but also in other international terrorist groups. This is certainly animating U.S. Desire to increase its efforts militarily in Afghanistan, whether or not that's a proper thing to do. But there is some talk now of losing control of the situation, the Afghan parties, to other fighters, outside fighters, and fragmented groups that are less able to cohere and negotiate from a common position. And I would say on the Afghan government side, that's true as well, per the ethnic polarization issue I mentioned. Another factor that we have, which is both destabilizing and I'll come back to later in the conclusion, maybe an opportunity, is the political fluidity of the situation. And this relates specifically to the election process. So most know that there's a parliamentary election scheduled to be held in October, and quickly following on that, there's a presidential election that's due according to the Constitution in April. And the political campaign season has already begun. No official declared candidates for president, but I think all political and security events in Afghanistan have to be seen with an assumed motivation for positioning in the lead up to the presidential election to gain advantage in one way or another, either politically or corruptly. So that makes it a very dynamic situation, and the silver lining of that, I would say, is maybe that presents opportunities for action and for change. Having said that, I would also add that having worked on Afghan elections since 2005, some others for even longer, the preparations are in worse shape right now than they've been for any previous election. And that's specifically speaking to the parliamentary election. Voter registration is behind, numbers are low, security is worse. So it is, I think, a precarious situation. While everybody, I think Afghans want elections to happen, they want them to happen well, and the conditions are not there right now. So that's a vulnerability. Let me switch back to how did we get here. The key argument in my paper looking at the political situation, but really the governance structures, is that one of the main, if not the most important root cause of instability in Afghanistan is political exclusion. And that happens on a number of levels. One, most obviously, and often commented on, is that the Taliban, I think for good reasons at the time, speaking as an American, were not invited to the bond process, but then they were also not included in the constitution making process, and were not welcome / have not been interested in joining any of the elections that have happened since 2004. So that's a key grievance, and you hear, I think, increasingly, and interested if Michael's hearing this too, that when you think about the possible terms of a settlement, to the Taliban? Would they join the constitutional order? The complaints that we hear are more along the lines of the Constitution's illegitimate because we weren't a part of it. Not so much that the fundamental structure of the state is incompatible. Obviously, there will be differences and grievances, but lack of inclusion in that process, I think, is an area to examine. If you look below that, you can see in the current fractured politics that the Tajik groups feel excluded from central government, really that they're not happy with their share of patronage. But nonetheless, if you look at the Unity Government Agreement, it was an argument, rightly or wrongly, for parity in how positions were dispensed in the current government. And if you look at the more recent dispute over removing Governor Atta from Balkh, the fundamental terms of that negotiation, as they unfolded, were about more fully realizing parity in appointments. So there's a sense of exclusion, rightly or wrongly, that they feel that I think will come up in the presidential elections. And then maybe more fundamentally, and this leads more toward the solutions, I think there's a fundamental exclusion of the people, the citizens, from their government. And this has manifest examples, and I think is one of the reasons why the Taliban find, if not active support, tacit acquiescence to their presence, particularly in rural areas, because people feel so disconnected from government. And there are electoral reasons and systemic reasons that I want to get into for that. There have not been local elections at all, although they're called for in the Constitution. But even when you look at the elections that have happened at the provincial council level, and particularly at the parliamentary level, you have very few people, voting for the winning candidates. We call this wasted votes in electoral terms. But something like a quarter of votes cast in elections for parliament actually go to a winning candidate because there are so many candidates and the losers outnumber the ultimate winners. So there's both a sense of services not being delivered and demands not being met, and corruption taking people's rights and choices away, but there are also governance reasons and governance systems that reinforce this. I think then if you look at the governance mechanisms that are in the Constitution, you see that the presidential system that they have is one of the most highly centralized in the world. The president has the authority to make appointments down to the district level, appoints governors as well, police chiefs, district governors. That's an enormous amount of power. And without mechanisms to systematically distribute that, the Unity Government Agreement was one partial attempt to do this. You have an enormous opportunity for abuse, and you also have accusations of unfairness that will inevitably come from that. You also have in Afghanistan extremely weak political parties, and this relates to electoral systems and choices that are made more in the law than in the Constitution. But the voting system which they have, which is single non-transferable vote, essentially means that political parties have a very difficult time organizing and identifying constituents and responding to their needs. And without strong political parties, or even modestly prominent political parties, it's very difficult to organize politics around issues, ultimately serving express needs of the people, and it becomes much more personality-based, and it reinforces the patronage trends that are already existing in Afghanistan. So when I think about the way forward and look to solutions, I think addressing the centralization of the system in ways that distribute power, political opportunity, and participation more to the local level, dividing it up into more pieces as a classic way of negotiation, to divide the pie and so each person can have their own piece of it. I think there are a few paths that have been discussed, admittedly, but have failed to be executed for a variety of reasons, and I think it's time for some new experimentation for the theme of this journal. So one is simply to have local elections. There's a debate that I think occurs in every transitional situation from non-government to governance, or at least in the democratization process? Is it better to start with local elections, or is it better to start with central and presidential elections? I think for reasons of expediency and security, keeping in mind the 9/11 context, the international community, particularly the US, weighed in to say we need a president, we need a commander-in-chief, and that we can deal with and we can move forward. And local elections can come later. While there's a logic to that, having not gotten around to local elections for now 17 years, or 13 since the Constitution, I think it's time to re-examine that. Having some way to have locally legitimate representation would engage people in politics more. I argue that it would reduce opportunities for corruption because people would actually see and understand the local dynamics, what power broker is making an unfair move and then rallying local forces against it, versus a very complex national system that big warlords can game and individual voters can barely understand. There's one good news, bad news element of that, which is that district council elections will now supposedly be held along with parliamentary elections in October. That's the good news, and it's in favor of it follows my argument for distributing power more locally. On the other hand, there have been very few preparations made for it, and most principally, there's no law that would say what the district council's duties would be, and that's the crucial aspect, is figuring out what's their role in the governance process. So we might get there in a backwards direction. Electoral reform and dealing with the voting system in a way that would increase political parties and representation is another crucial decision that needs to be made. This was one of the key pillars of the National Unity Government Agreement. There was a commission formed on this, and they deadlocked. And I can say much more on that. But fundamentally, this is a hurdle that needs to be overcome. And the final idea for a solution is to look beyond, given the limitations of capacity, of security, of citizen understanding of the electoral process. Look beyond the current system of voting to perhaps include indirect elections. This is actually against the Constitution technically, but of course in the US we have an electoral college, which is in form of indirect elections, whereby you assign, based on population, a certain number of votes to states, and then whoever wins the state, then those electors contribute their votes to the president. This would be a way of balancing and locking in the relative influence and power of provinces and regions in Afghanistan, regardless of whether only one person can vote because of bad security, or if millions of people in a province come out. You regulate the power of the provinces in a more systematic way. This can also be done at the local level, and I think in fact does happen informally with some of the development shuras, the community development councils and the district development councils, where you have representatives of villages or family groups that come together and they choose representatives in a more balanced and egalitarian way. So those are some ideas to throw on the table. Just drawing to a close and thinking about the moment that we face now, which is dynamic and fluid. You know, a lot is just said about this has to be an Afghan solution, and you made the point, Anna, that this is focused on Afghanistan. But I think the experience of the last 17 years shows that left alone, these political issues do not resolve themselves. And so I think that there's a middle ground between pushing this on Afghans and letting them decide, and internationals imposing a solution which is not appropriate, but rather seeking a more active mediation role so that on some of these key issues that Afghans do agree need to be resolved, they can't decide the answer, the internationals can coax them and guide them toward an Afghan solution.
Thanks very much, Scott. Michael.
Thanks to everyone for coming along, because this is a time when we run the risk of Afghanistan's about falling off the agenda, getting ignored, going wrong, and forcing it way back on in a more dreadful fashion. So, it's genuinely important for people to stay engaged. I'd like to thank the stalwarts like Francis Vendrell, who's with us, as an example of somebody who, of the highest level of public service, which has included supporting peace around the world and engagement for years in Afghanistan, struggling to pursue peace and staying engaged. But I look around and I see Robin Raphael, who is also has a distinguished record of public service and a particular engagement in the region of Afghanistan and Pakistan, and stays engaged. And in civil society, people like Elizabeth looking the other way. I mean, no, it's an example. It's very important. In the room, we have millennials. We are welcome to the millennials. It's great. It's good. No, it's really good. There are millennials engaging in this, and stalwarts who are already fully adults and fully involved well before 9/11. It's important. I consider myself an optimist, and I agree with the points that Kate was making that peace is possible. There are a few green shoots, but I also think that we're sitting on the edge of the precipice as well. And there's a point made in the report that there are, you can broadly categorize the two different visions for Afghanistan. It goes off in the direction of unending conflict, violence sustained with no end for the war, in a sense, the kind of the conversation that Anna was talking about with one of the Taliban commanders, who said, that it's not the same war that we started, but it's just the one that has its own dynamics and it goes on and on. That is a very realistic possibility, but that does not mean a continuation of the current situation. That means things get better, get worse. Because it will atrophy. The current political formula in Kabul cannot sustain for another 2, 3 or 4 years. It will collapse. That the US cannot sustain the current form of engagement. It's not that it costs too much. It's just that it's just not worth it. And somebody's going to, and there isn't the political support in the US. We know, if people realise what's happening in Afghanistan and the limited returns, it'll be cut. And there'll be a new narrative about how it wasn't actually that important. It wasn't our problem. It was somebody else's problem. We tried, or whatever. And so, the report will be correct. It's a continuation of the violence, but with new permutations. And things will go. They'll be so bad that we couldn't quite envisage how that they could get that bad. Whether you think in terms of the elite that we've propped up for the past few years will be, fleeing or lynched. The migration patterns, and of course it'll all be our fault, and it will undermine the authority of any of the international figures and institutions who have been associated with this project of the past 2 decades. And that's an awful lot of people and institutions, and that add up to a global governance crisis. So anyway, look, as I'm a residual optimist, but I see that there's a realistic warning in the report that can happen in Afghanistan. The alternative is we're not holding up the possibility of this great grand bargain that, hey, we wake up one day, read the news, oh, there's been a deal. That's why this is called incremental peace. It's making things better gradually, step by step. So in a funny sort of way, I think people haven't quite clearly aspired to previously, but that's as good as it gets in Afghanistan. And you know what? I think that's many Afghans, probably a majority of Afghans, would buy that. I'd like to say a couple of things about the report itself. I sort of felt that when Anna and Alex sort of described who's on board in this report, they said it correctly, and I agree. But I sort of would like to add a little bit of a bit more almost like whether it's either emotional or social content to it. This is this fascinating example. This report has actually got social power inside it. That the people who come on board, international and Afghan, it's fascinating, and it's almost like it's a case study of sort of what has to happen in a real peace process, because the core team has managed to get Afghans who are revered by their own constituencies, even if they may be reviled by many others. But everybody in Afghanistan realizes, you said when Gulbuddin Hekmatyar says something in Afghanistan, whether you love him or hate him, you take some notice. The fact that we've got Hile Najibullah is in a very credible way is in a sound way is describing what her father was trying to do. But I know now everybody sits up and take note when it's got something to do with Dr. Najib. Suhail Shaheen from the Taliban. If you remember back to the attempt to set up another attempt at a peace process, this is the opening of the Taliban office in Qatar. I mean, Suhail is the poor guy who was hoarse by the end of the day, explaining what they were trying to do. And of course it didn't go well, but you know what, he was the guy who actually, he faced the world media for, non-stop trying to explain, what a peace process was. So, he's not just some other, any old fly-by-night. He is that, he was like the public face of the Taliban's sort of, trying to get involved in some kind of peace process. I mean, for people, like old favourites, like favourites like Barney, who's been involved in this forever. I mean, longer than any of us. It's great. It's great they come on board, and people like Doug Lute. I mean, when we're talking about the proximity, the process. I mean, as in the kind of person about critical points when during attempts at a process. I mean, Doug Lute is the one who has to walk into the White House, into the Oval Office, and say, "Mr. President, we need your support on this." So, I mean, well done. I'm Scott's done. It's not just he's been associated with an election. I mean, he's had formal status on the electoral body. Trying to clean things up. So that's good. The core team managed to convene a diverse set of people who collectively have social weight and authority. And without necessarily agreeing individually, cooperating on producing a useful output. So I mean that counts. And now that may that be a model for peace process. But I mean, some of the things that I'm worried about at the moment, that they, in what I've written, I've referred very briefly to this idea of dualism, which I think that somehow people are not quite taking on board how important the idea of dualism. Almost 2 decades ago, when we had the bond settlement, there was this idea of internationally sponsored agreement amongst Afghan elites about what governance would look like in Afghanistan. The reality in 2018 is that there are 2 systems in Afghanistan, and that which is sort of the offspring of the Bonn Agreement now controls a progressively shrinking proportion of the territory and of the population. Possibly, majority of the population probably still live in space which is largely dominated by the sort of the offshoot of Bonn, but the trend is downwards, and in territory it's probably the other way around. And so it's, the Taliban are not just a ragtag army or they're not just insurgents. As far as they're concerned, they're running an Islamic emirate. And I think it's right, as we heard in the previous comments, that it's not that the Taliban are winning any popularity contests inside Afghanistan, but they have managed to engage social power in a sort of a way that's often the system that that sort of like the international community has not. And I think for me, if I were to come up with a metric of the problem with the system in Afghanistan, it wouldn't be about proportion of population. It wouldn't be about the territory. It would be something about social power, the extent to which social power in Afghanistan is engaged with the government in Afghanistan, and that's collapsing. And I haven't had the privilege of Scott to go around and talk to all our old friends in Kabul over the past couple of weeks. But 2 days ago, I sat and I actually watched a little video clip of actually somebody that Anna interviewed, filmed the clip up in northern Afghanistan in Khwaja Sabzposh, one of the districts in Faryab, and I think of the sound of broken glass crunching under his feet as he walked through a trashed compound of one of the pro-government commanders who in an area which has just been overrun by the Taliban, and to symbolize the way that they are pushing back the elite which has been sort of clinging to power in this strange deal. They trash the house in the way that Kate and I have been through trashed houses like that, unfortunately, over the years. And you look around, and it absolutely symbolises the destruction of the order which is there propping up Kabul, and so they're the little fiefs that they've got trying to hold on to some bits of the rural areas. And all the geraniums are upset. The glass is all broken. You can see the smoke all over the walls, and that and it's interesting that the person that Anne interviewed just goes through saying, this is not good. This is not good. This is not good. Because they have they've successfully led an insurgency against a bit of that bit of social power, but without any clarity about what on earth is replacing it. So there's a very dangerous kind of dualism being installed. I will only say, you're going to throw me out in a couple of minutes. You know what? The next point actually was I was very concerned about time, not from what I want to say. That time is important in these. We've got one of the pieces in the report from Chris Calenda talking about the importance of having time for a peace process. We've got the point from Hila Najibullah talking about how that Najib was perhaps on the right lines in terms of damping down the violence, but ran out of time. I'm worried about that we run out of time. Part of the rationale of this incremental peace process is it's a way of getting time back on our side. Hence, the focus on bringing down violence as a strategic priority and brought forward, rather than our metric should not be the number of bombs that we increase. It's about the extent to which we avail of all opportunities to bring down the violence, because the way that authority of international community and the elites in Kabul has greatly diminished of the failures over the past few years. One of the few ways of legitimizing what you're doing in a peace process is to deliver something which matters to people, and the most obvious thing that you can deliver is bring down the violence. That matters to legitimize the process inside Afghanistan because people see that and they buy into it. It also matters internationally because I believe that if those responsible for this in Afghanistan can show in the US, can show internationally that we've turned the trend on violence, that can buy a little bit more time. It doesn't cost that much to help to fix Afghanistan, but you have to have the time to be there engaged. And then gradually, incrementally, step by step, address the vast range of challenges involved in putting together a new social contract. Read about it, I'm not going to give you the details. This is fundamentally different from the way that we've approached peace previously, because it's sort of a golden grail approach, where the golden grail is something which, of course, it's great in itself. You may not never actually grasp the golden grail, but the challenge for the golden grail is so noble that that is, in a sense, is what you deliver. So it is the process of bringing down violence and then gradually starting to rebuild a social contract. That's as good as it gets into Afghanistan. And don't worry if none of us lives long enough to see this is the great signing where all the Afghans and internationals sit together and they sign a peace agreement whereby they've solved all the problems in Afghanistan. Those problems will be solved gradually over time.
Thanks very much.
So, I just wanted to take this opportunity to thank Anna Larsen for involving me to contribute in this in the launch of the Accord, as well as to contribute with my thoughts in its very important advocacy magazine, I would say, on reconciliation and peace building in Afghanistan. I would like to also thank a dear friend, Jawed Nader, who put me in touch with Anna here, because in last year, 2017, January, my book on Afghan reconciliation and social healing was published, and for me, it was a journey to put down my experiences of what I understood reconciliation was, what it entailed for me to deal with the traumas that personally I had endured in terms of conflict, and then politically, because in some way, whether call it a burden or a privilege, I'm a politician's daughter who happened to be the president of the country, and for me, my journey started with understanding of why I lost my loved ones. And what exactly did he want to achieve? What were the policies, the good and the bad? And here I am, sitting in front of you all. In my research, of course, when I started hearing about reconciliation, I must say I was 10 years old. That's when the National Reconciliation Policy was launched in Afghanistan in 1987. And it was a matter of discussion and hope for Afghanistan that was at that point of time in conflict for 7 years. It's different circumstances now. It's almost 40 years, my lifetime, that we're in conflict. So, so my idea was to look at what entailed for the Najibullah government to come up and launch the national reconciliation policies. What were some of the challenges? What were some of the successes? And how today we can learn from that process and perhaps work together towards an Afghanistan that could be peaceful. Of course, my understanding and my research made me realize that the notion of reconciliation, or the term itself, is highly political in Afghanistan. So you always see it as a top-down approach. But once I started studying conflict transformation and peace building, I realized that there needs to be different approaches in terms of peace building, and that what both the reconciliation process in 1986 during Najibullah's government and what in 2010 that was launched during President Karzai's government was missing was the middle-out approach, or what the conflict management people would say, the bottom-up approach, where people could be a part of the process. I would like to quote, actually, I have a quote from one of my favorite peace scholars, John Paul Lederer, who's actually from the United States, where he says, he defines reconciliation that in essence it represents a place, the point of encounter where concerns about both the past and future meet. For this to happen, people must find ways to encounter themselves, their enemies, their hopes and fears. And I think that's what the court as an instrument is trying to do. And I hope that this could allow us to reflect more on the challenges that we will face together, not only at a political level, but as the people, because conflicts touch everyone of us. But of course, you could dissolve those conflicts through agreements. However, you cannot dissolve the traumas and the fears and the problems that are in your mind because of what you faced. So it's important that we do consider those social aspects of peace building as well, and make sure that the reconciliation processes in Afghanistan are people-centric, that they do have a voice, that it's not top-down or bottom-up, that it's holistic. Not only dualistic, but holistic in multi-dimensional ways, that it's multi-layered, because indeed Afghanistan's situation is such that you can not only, you must engage with external stakeholders. Afghanistan has been in conflict where external stakeholders from the Cold War era, even before that actually, have been involved. So what we must engage at international and regional level, but we must also engage at national, provincial, and grassroots level, which somehow is not happening, and there needs to be a thread that connects it all. I'm very much like you, I'm an optimist, but we have to be realistic as well. There is an institutional structure in Afghanistan for which I'm very happy. The Peace Council is there. However, there are lots of gaps, and an extremely important potential to engage with the grassroots levels and to be able to give the people of Afghanistan a voice, and also a space to build a shared future.